Hello there, listener. Please allow yourself to get comfortable. Now, let's get sleepy. I've been friends with Art for a long time. We live in a small town, and had first met at the one playground that the town had. He was building a complicated sandcastle, which was awe-inspiring to the 6-year-old me. He was the same age, but way advanced in the art of sandpacking. I had joined in and followed his instructions to help build a moat. From then, Art and I were firm friends. His parents named him Arthur, but Art always sounded right to me. More him. After all, he was an artist. When Art first showed me his drawings more than 10 years ago, at the tender age of 7, they had still been amateurish. I was still really impressed, though. His skills were far beyond what my own 7-year-old hands could achieve. Where I was still drawing snowmen with circles, he was drawing faces and figures which bore distinctive resemblances to the people they were based on. By the time we were in our teens, Art had blossomed so much as an artist that he had become transferred from our regular high school into a school meant for gifted artists. His drawings morphed into realistic portraits of people, things, and nature. Despite the realism, his drawings retained a style that was distinctly his. He had this way of capturing people's expressions, quirks, and nuances that really brought his drawings to life. He kept drawing, and they kept getting better. I noticed that he stopped drawing pictures of actual objects in the world. Instead, he turned to creating places, people, and things that were pulled from his imagination. He said that the world was too dark, too cold a cruel place to be worth recreating in art. He had always been a rather pessimistic, cynical person, so I wasn't surprised by this. I didn't mind. He was still hell of a good friend, and personally, I preferred his new artworks to the old. When it came time to choose a college, he decided to go to the local college with me. He said that he was sick of being saturated in the arts, and wanted to go to a college that offered variety. I was pleased. I figured we'd have a good time together at college. In our first year, we spent a lot of time together. However, every night after 9 p.m., he'd retreat back to his room and draw. Sometimes I hung out with him in his room, studying or working on my personal research. However, as time went by, I started spending more nights out partying and chilling at other friends' hangouts. I stopped inviting him along for every event, given his usual declination. We still remained good friends, though. That never changed. Art became more and more reclusive, hardly making friends with anyone else. He developed more extreme views of society and the world. In soft tones, he would tell me about what was wrong with the world and how it could be saved. That the world as it was doomed. It didn't affect our friendship. I actually liked his musings and found him interesting in a weird way. I got close to quite a few other friends too, especially Nathan. He was like the brother I never had. We hit it off right away, and we gradually picked up Eddie and Sean along the way. Soon we were hanging out almost every day, and the 4 of us became pretty good friends. Nathan went missing 2 months ago. I wasn't shocked when I first heard that he hadn't returned home after a party at friends. he was quite the drinker, and I figured he had drunk himself silly and was sleeping it off somewhere in town. But when he didn't show for the whole of the next day, I got really concerned. I must have called him 20 times that night, and I realized I hadn't seen him in any of the lectures we had together. His parents were really worried too, but we held out hope that he was just dealing with a nasty hangover somewhere, that he had his own reasons for not wanting to get home just yet. I remember the sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach when the next day came and passed, and there was still no sign of him. It was soon a full 48 hours since anyone last saw him, and his parents made a police report. The sheriff and his people were everywhere for the next week. I was the first to be interviewed. I told them everything I remembered from the night he went missing. I was at the party too, and we were both downing shots like there was no tomorrow. I'd gotten pretty drunk, and he was still going strong, with his stomach of steel and whatnot. I'd got separated from him when he left the party to go answer a call. I was roped into a game of beer pong, which I lost terribly, which meant I had to down many more cups of beer. The rest of the night was a haze, and I didn't remember him coming back in. I wasn't worried then, as we often went our own ways and did our own things at parties. No one else remembered anything of use to. Someone remembered seeing him frowning and speaking on the phone out in the front yard, but didn't see where he went after. By the time Nathan had been missing for 2 weeks, we had all started to fear the worst. The police investigation went on, but no one seemed to be looking hard anymore. Eddie and Sean came over often. They knew how close Nathan and I had been, and how hard hit I was by Nathan's disappearance. We'd talk about what could have happened, share our own theories. None of us wanted to talk about the theory that was in the forefront of our minds, that something bad had happened to him, and he was never coming back. Then, Eddie went missing. This time I was brought into the police station for a long 12-hour interrogation. I cried at some points, repeated the same story, the only one I knew, and answered all the questions they had. Sean was also brought in for questioning. When it was all over and we were both released home, I was in a bad state. It was the second time I'd lost a friend. Sean and I stopped hanging out after that. We were both too traumatized by the disappearance of Nathan and Eddie. Hanging out with Sean felt weird after that. Whenever I spoke to him, all I was reminded of was the absence of Nathan and Eddie. I think Sean felt that way too, for he stopped reaching out as well. I still met with Art pretty often. I no longer went over to his place to hang out. He had said that he was in the midst of a major project, and his place was a war zone. Art tried to comfort me, but he wasn't very good at it. He just served up the usual, "I'm sure they're fine, they're safe, you'll see them again," and so on. But he was a stable, comforting presence in my life, and it was good to just hang out without us saying much. Things went on like that for a while. Eddie and Nathan were nowhere to be found. Sean called me one night. He said that Art had invited him over to his place. Sean felt taken aback, as Art and him barely hung out. They had exchanged only the perfunctory hellos and crossed paths due to me. Sean was at his front door, but everything was dark, he said. He wanted to know if I was going to be there as well. Art had told him that he wanted to show him the art piece he had been working on. I was surprised and a little hurt. Art hadn't offered to show me, his oldest friend, His art piece. Why was he calling Sean, of all people, to see his work?
Oh, he's here. He just came to the door. I'll talk to you later, okay?
Sean said, and hung up. I texted Art to ask him about inviting Sean over. Art replied with a simple message. You can come over tomorrow. I let it be, and spent the night watching TV, distracting myself from the sadness and fear I felt for Nathan and Eddie. The next day, once class had ended, I went over to Art's place. He invited me into his room, and then he opened the door. I could see what he meant by saying it was a war zone. There was paper everywhere, on the floor, on the easel, pasted on the walls and hung up on string. He cleared a path for me to the bed, where we sat down and stared at a few of the pieces of his recent work. They were beautiful. I soon realized that the different art pieces were snapshots and images from the same place, a place that had a magical quality to it. He drew cobblestone streets lit with antique lamps at the sides, quaint stone cottages with lush gardens, and a forest that filled the background. He also drew pictures of a mountain in the distance, a town square, a library, and so on. He had created a whole town in art. Do you like them? He asked, anticipation lacing his voice. They're awesome. This place looks fantastic. How long did you spend on these? He grinned, pleased as punch. I've spent the last 6 months or so working on these. Here, this is the map of the town I'm creating. He sprawled out a map he had carefully constructed, completed with a legend, a scale, and different markings. I was blown away. Dude, you could be a city architect, or whatever they call those people who design cities. This is incredible. Man, I wish our town looked like this. I could tell that Art was immensely proud of his work. Then I caught a glimpse of anxiety in his eyes. He cleared his throat nervously, then picked up large squares of paper from his table. With a solemn gesture, he laid the pieces by my side. I picked the first one up. It was a drawing of a cottage with old wooden doors, stone walls covered with vines, and big sunny windows. I froze. Someone was at a window. Someone who looked very much like Eddie. The Eddie in the picture was staring out the window with his eyes wide, full of fear. His signature scar by his temple clearly pictured. He looked like he was trying to get the window open. He was moving. I looked at Art in complete shock. He looked away. Trembling, I picked up the next piece of paper. It was Sean. Sean was pictured to be in a room, which contained a cheerful fireplace and a brown couch with colorful rugs strewn over it. Sean was sat in a corner of the room, hugging his knees, looking miserably at the fireplace. Then he turned to look at me and started to gesture frantically. I couldn't hear him, but his mouth was opening and closing, and I could see from the bulge in his forehead that he was yelling with all his might. I felt nausea rising within. I picked up the last piece of paper. Sure enough, there was Nathan. Nathan was by a river. He was seated with his back turned towards me, and he was still for the most part. I could read his resignation by the slump of his shoulders. What's this? I choked out. How is this happening? Art finally turned to look at me. I wanted to create a town, a place that is full of beauty and comfort, some place just for us, for the people who deserve it. I know you're close to Nathan, Eddie, and Sean. I know they're nice guys, too. I thought we could all hang out here instead. I looked at him, fighting the disbelief that enveloped me. Every time I looked up from the art pieces, I would immediately think that I was dreaming, that it wasn't really happening, that my senses were going crazy, that no one was really moving in these pictures. But every time I looked back down, there they were, still struggling at the window, still yelling, still shifting about once in a while. How did you get them in? Art shrugged. I just kind of knew I could. As I was drawing this town, I just knew that it was a place we could enter. I drew us all in. Then I got each of them to touch their drawing. They got sucked in then. I looked around. This had to be a joke. An elaborate plan. Months in the making. It wasn't April. But perhaps there's some massive reality show going on. A show that involved everyone in town, the sheriff, the officer. It didn't make sense, I knew. But it still made more sense than what Art had said. How are you making this happen? I asked. Come on, joke's over. Stop messing with me. Art didn't respond. He just looked at me. I looked back down, unnerved. Then I saw Nathan turn in the drawing. He caught sight of me, and his eyes widened. He started yelling, unheard. It was like watching a movie on mute. Then I saw Nathan kneel down. He was writing something in the soil. I took a closer look. Help, he was writing. Art. Danger. The chills went down my spine. Art sighed. He doesn't get that I'm doing this for us. He doesn't get it yet. I'm making a whole new life in a whole new world. For us. For the people that made the cut. Art went to the table and pulled out another piece of paper from his drawer. He placed it in front of me. I spotted it immediately, the figure of me. He had drawn me at a playground. It was similar to the one in our town, but a much fancier, more aesthetically pleasing version. I was building a sandcastle in the picture. The drawing of me didn't move. There was something flat about it. It lacked the spark of realism that the other drawings had. Touch it, Art said. Let's go. I've got my own drawn up. Let's go in this town together. No, I said, gritting my teeth. You've got to let them out. He stared at me inside again. I knew you would take time to get used to the idea. Just touch the figure of yourself. You can see for yourself the town we'd be living in, the world I created. You'll realize how much better it is than this world. I started to back away. Then he grabbed me. In a few quick moves, he got behind me and pressed me to his chest. There was a knife at my throat. My mouth gaped open in shock. I couldn't believe what was happening. Art had never pulled a knife on anyone. He wasn't a violent person. Now, place your hand on the picture. Do it now. I didn't move. The knife bit slightly into my neck. It stung. I'm sorry. I really don't want to hurt you. This is for your sake. It's for our sakes. Please, we need to go there. To be in a better place. Why don't you go there for yourself? Why drag us into it? I asked, anger arising past the fear. I don't want to be alone. I want others there. Good people there. Let me go, Art. Art, please. You've got to stop this. Let them out. At that tense moment, there was the sound of a car pulling up in the front of the house. They're not supposed to be back for another week, Art cried. Sensing his hold weaken for a second, I grabbed the arm holding the knife and jerked backwards, knocking him off balance. He fell back with a thud and released his hold on me. I smashed his hand on the floor, and the knife clattered to the side. Looking around wildly, I grabbed the pencil holder from his table. The pencil holder was a steel sculpture that mimicked rows of paintbrushes lined together to form a box shape. It was a gift I had given him for his birthday. When we were teens, I paid $5 for it at a yard sale. He had loved it. With all the force I could muster, I swung the steel holder into his head as he was trying to get up. It connected with a dull thud, and Art flopped back down. He stopped moving. Blood started to ooze from his head. Gripped with fear, I checked his pulse. He was still alive. I breathed out the breath I'd been holding. Then I heard the front door opening. I looked at the scene before me and realized what it would look like to his parents. I was screwed. Then an idea flashed into my mind. I hurriedly searched through his drawer. Sure enough, there it was. A drawing of Art himself in the town square. He was holding a sign that said, "Welcome to our new home." I grabbed the drawing and rushed over to Art's inert body. I placed his hand on the drawn figure of himself. Nothing happened for a moment. Then, right in front of my incredulous eyes, Art seemed to get sucked into the picture. His hand and arm went first. Then his entire body got drawn into the small space of the picture, distorting in size as it went in. Then Art was gone. From this world, at least. The smiling picture of him was now replaced by his unconscious form, lying on the ground. Around the drawing of his head, red trickled out. I wiped up the spot of blood on the floor with the shirt strewn on his bed. I stuffed it in the backpack. I hastily grabbed the other pieces of paper with Nathan, Eddie, Sean on them. I then grabbed as many of the other pieces of artwork as I could and stuffed them in my bag.
"Arthur, are you home?"
The voice sounded out from downstairs. Composing myself and finger-combing my hair in place, I slung my backpack on. Then I opened the door, a smile plastered on my face. "Hey, Jamie." Arthur's mom was one of those hip ladies who insisted that you call them by their first names. "Hey, you're here. Where's Arthur?" "Art went out to get some stuff he left at school. He told me to wait here, but it's been quite a while and he's not back yet. Really do have to go. My parents are waiting for me. Movie night." "Yeah, alright. I hope you had a good vacation." I did indeed. Too bad it was cut short. Emergency work stuff and such. Well, I won't keep you. Gotta go then. I sat alone in my room, the 5 drawings of us in front of me. The others were gone from their respective drawings now, and they were all surrounding Art in the town square. They didn't seem particularly inclined want to help him. I'm not sure what to do next. Perhaps I'll go to the police, but I'd shown my parents the pictures, thinking that there was no way I could explain what was going on, but they had to see for themselves. They didn't see anything. They just saw the still, unmoving image of the town square. When I kept pointing out the 4 figures in the square, they just looked at me with bewilderment, exchanging looks of alarm with each other. When my dad suggested calling the emergency psych services, I changed track really quickly. I pretended that it was all a joke, an experiment my friends and I had agreed to do on our parents. They got mad then. I just kept saying sorry. They rebuked me, then excused myself to my room. I stared at them looking up at me from the picture for a while longer, feeling helpless, then tucked them in my drawer. I wanted to wait for Art to wake up, to tell me how they could get out. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept Googling possible ways to undo whatever Art had done, but couldn't get anything usable or feasible. When the sky lightened again, I was still hard at work, listing out all the ways I could think of, or what was suggested online. I was going to try them all one by one. I glanced at the art piece again. They were no longer in the town square. I found them in the cottage, the one with the fireplace. I did a double take when I saw what they were doing. Art was tied up on the floor. Nathan was holding the poker in the fire, heating it up. The rest were watching nervously. They appeared to be asking Art questions. Eddie looked up and saw me. He started gesturing, then went out of the picture for a moment. He came back with a pen and paper. I had to squint to see what he was writing. Art knows a way. He is coming for you. We will find out. I could feel the blood drain from my face. I don't know if I feared for Art or more for myself. If Art had a way of getting out, that meant I was still in danger, but that also meant my friends could get out. Nathan looked up at me, holding the poker. He must have seen the horror on my face, because he mouthed, "Don't look." He pulled the poker from the fire. It was white hot at the end. He moved towards Art, as the rest took a step back. I took Nathan's advice and rolled the paper up. I was glad I couldn't hear them. I didn't want to hear Art's screams, or smell Art's flesh sizzling. I placed the rolled-up sheets in my wardrobe and locked it. It was up to them now. think your parents are in a cult," my friend Todd said to me. It took me by surprise, and I tried to pause my game. Then remembered it was online and that I couldn't. My character died a moment later. I was so stunned by what he had said, I was no longer paying attention. "What are you talking about?" I asked him, passing him the game controller. We were playing a battle royale game, and he was terrible at it. So I knew he would die, and it would be my turn again soon. It was late at night, and we were sitting in my basement on old couches. Spring poked out into my back, and foam material poked out of holes in the coffee-stained armrests. My parents were asleep upstairs, so I wasn't really worried about them overhearing. Still, I kept my voice down. "You didn't think there was anything weird about that church service today?" he asked, tapping the controller against his knee. He sat up straight and held the controller more tightly, focused on lasting more than 2 minutes in this game this time. "Land on the outskirts," I said. "You're gonna die immediately if you try to land in one of the popular spots." He waited for a while before dropping into the game, and I thought he might do a bit better this time. That church pastor, man, he's fucking weird. What were they saying about a 30-day fast? Won't they die if none of them eat for 30 days? Your mom and dad are really gonna do that? Todd had been forced to accompany us to church since it was a condition of the sleepover. I had moved to Grantville with my family a couple of years before, and Todd was my best friend from my old hometown. He came over once in a while, but less and less frequently these days. As much as I had promised myself I wouldn't let it happen, I was losing touch with my old friends. I was hanging out with people I had met at school here a lot more lately. It had taken me 2 full years to finally make some friends. I know, that's a long time, tell me about it. My other friends from Bellwood hardly spoke to me anymore. Todd was the only one I still saw. We had been best friends. "It's a juice fast. Yeah, I know, it's really weird. You're gonna have broth and soup and stuff too, I guess, but still. No solid food for a month. I really don't get it. I'm just glad I don't have to do it." My folks are probably worried about having children's aid called on them, I thought to myself. They just said I was exempted because I needed my energy for schoolwork and extracurricular activities. Everybody in that place is so mesmerized by that pastor, too. It's freaky, man, Todd said, focused on the game. I hadn't noticed it before, but I was really accustomed to it. From an outsider's perspective, I guessed it had been a bit strange. The church had grown over the last couple of years and now had a couple hundred members. When we had first started going, it was only a dozen or so of us. We had upgraded to newer and bigger buildings along the way. The people in the church respected the charismatic pastor, Steve, so much they fawned over him constantly and revered him. They regarded him from their pews silently, respectfully, and with glowing admiration. Now there were a couple hundred people competing for his attention, and with increasing fervor. If someone even so much as coughed during one of his sermons, they were shushed from 6 different directions and given death glares from dozens of reprimanding eyes. Aside from that, nobody ever stopped smiling at church, like a bunch of jokers. Their teeth showed constantly before and after service, to show everyone how happy they were to be there. I hated how fake it felt, and refused to keep a phony grin plastered on my face every Sunday. I had gotten several comments about my sour face from smiling parishioners who asked me what was wrong every time they saw me. It was infuriating. The latest iteration of the church had been a huge transformation. A lot of the parishioners were involved in construction trades, so it had been decided a new church would be built on the pastor's land. He lived on a big farm, and there were many acres of land there. Talk had begun about building houses on the land too, where parishioners could move if they so wished, to form a little community. My parents were excited about the prospect, and I was more than a bit annoyed they were talking about moving again. I had just begun to make friends in the city, and now they wanted to move out to the country to live on a subdivided farm owned by the church pastor. I was only 16 though, so what could I really do other than voice my protests and be ignored? Yeah, I know, it's kind of weird, I said, a bit self-consciously. Kinda weird? Man, it's fucking bananas in that place. People speaking in tongues, casting demons out of gay people, that guy rolling around on the floor screaming. What kind of weird shit is that anyways? The more I thought about it, the more embarrassed I became. It was a crazy scene in there. It was a good thing he hadn't come on Rattlesnake Day 2 weekends ago, I thought. I doubted Todd would sleep over on a Saturday again. I took a sip from the sickly sweet lemon vodka cooler we had gotten my brother to buy at Todd's request. We had successfully managed to hide them from my parents all weekend. Well, I don't know what to do. They said I don't have to go anymore when I turn 18, so it's only a couple of years. What's the worst that could happen? Just don't drink the fucking Kool-Aid, man, that's all I'm saying. He gave me a serious look, and I nodded. It was good advice, and I vowed to follow it. 10 months later, I was on the back of a large wagon, hauling bundles of hay and stacking them in neat piles. There was a lot of work to be done in the communal fields. My mom's hair was in disarray, and she had dark circles under her eyes, but her grin was wide and manic. She had sweat stains all over the front of her shirt and under her arms. No doubt I looked the same, minus the smile. The church pastor, Steve, was up front on the tractor. He was driving the tractor which pulled the hay wagon, wearing sunglasses and a ball cap. I noticed his white t-shirt looked clean and dry. He had soundproof headphones to block out the noises from the tractor, and a little fan was blowing into his face. He looked back at us once in a while and yelled directions while he swatted at horseflies, sweating, grunting, pulling bales of hay up from the ground. The friendly grin never left his face, and everyone followed his commands without question. The group just continued nodding and smiling regardless of how exhausted they all were. This was day 3 of our collective effort to bundle hay for the property, so that it could be used to feed the communal livestock. There had been lots of projects like this lately, and I was always voluntold to help. I barely had time for homework anymore, but there was talk of homeschooling programs starting soon, with all the kids from church to be taught by Steve, the pastor. We had a diploma from a teacher's college, so it was only a matter of sorting out the legal paperwork. By next September, we would all be his students, and not just on Sundays. A horsefly took a big chunk out of the back of my leg, behind my knee, and I yelped and swatted it. I lifted my hand and saw a large pool of blood and a squished bug body. One of the pastor's kids, David, saw me and gave me a stern look, furrowing his brow. He wagged his finger at me and told me I shouldn't kill living things, and said he was going to tell his dad. Oh, great, I thought to myself. Anytime I did anything within eyesight of the pastor's 4 kids lately, I was sure to hear about it later, even if it was innocent and I had done nothing wrong. Ironically, they were all hell-raisers who did nothing but stir up shit and cause trouble. My friend, Todd, refuses to come over now. Since we had moved to the communal farm, he had gotten into a fight with the pastor's son, David, who was about our age. The fight had started because David had thrown a rock at Todd's head, leaving a large goose egg and a laceration. Somehow, Todd had been blamed, according to my parents, and the pastor, who had been quite angry with him for some reason. David was unscathed since he was a foot taller than Todd and knocked him unconscious with one blow to my friend's temple. I visited Todd at his house now, infrequently. My parents refused to drive me there, so it was tough to find a way over. Most days I ended up stranded on the communal farm, and as such, was forced to help with the never-ending labor. Our house was still being built, so we lived in a large building with several other families, and absolutely no privacy. It was a teenager's worst nightmare. The wagon was full, and I was told to stay behind the hay fields and wait for them to come back. My brother and I were given vague instructions. Basically, we would be standing around, doing nothing, since the hay bales were already tied up and ready to go. I looked at my brother Richard with a confused expression. He was a year older, so was almost free of this insanity. He said he was going to get out of here on his 18th birthday. We watched the wagon drive off and sat around for a while, complaining and swatting at flies and mosquitoes. We were both drenched in sweat and couldn't wait to be finished for the day. We usually worked until dinner, then called it quits, but today we had been forced to go back out afterwards to work until the sun went down. The expectations on us seemed to be getting greater and greater every day. There was only time for one more wagon load, I realized. The sun would be setting soon. The bugs were becoming more and more ferocious, and I wished I had bought a bottle of bug spray. We sat there waiting for 20 minutes or so, and I was beginning to wonder if they'd forgotten us out in the fields, when my brother grabbed my wrist and exclaimed in shock, "What the hell is that?" He jumped backwards, and I saw his eyes were wide, terrified. He was pointing into the woods. I followed his gaze and looked carefully into the foliage, straining my eyes in the dim light. I saw what looked to be a wolf, sitting in the shadows off the edge of the field. "It's a wolf, I think," I said, my voice trembling. I saw movement to the right and looked to see the bushes swaying back from being disturbed, as if something had just gone past them. I looked around, suddenly terrified. "There's more of them," my brother said in a whisper. I saw them now, too. There were a few more, dotted around us at odd angles like a hunting party. But wolves don't usually hunt people, I thought. Something was strange about the wolves, too. I looked closer, but it was hard to see in the gathering darkness. It was their bodies. They didn't look right. The fur was all wrong, patchy and ill-fitting. I realized with alarm that these were not wolves. These were people in wolf clothing. The wolf faces were actually masks. I whispered this to Richard, and he nodded his head, saying he had just noticed the same thing. I said we should run. He agreed. We got up from where we stood and bolted back towards the road. We took a logical shortcut through a patch of trees, and that was our mistake. They had predicted it. I felt the world turn sickeningly upside down, and it took me a moment to realize I was ensnared in a trap. Everything was spinning, and I saw I was hanging in a cargo net that swung from a high branch on a tall tree. I saw that Richard had gotten past the trap somehow and was running back towards the commune. Hopefully, he can get back there and call the police, I thought. I screamed after him, telling him to get help. He looked back over his shoulder and kept running, a terrified look on his face. Panic turned to dread when I saw him fall through the facade of leaves covering the pit. He disappeared from view, and I heard him howling in pain a moment later. They had set 2 traps for us, it seemed. Maybe more. See, Jason, this is why you need to remember not to be a sheep. The familiar voice of Steve, the pastor, called up to me. He lifted up his wolf mask just for a second, revealing his always present smile. Then he replaced the mask. His sermon last week had been all about not following bad examples set by people. Even if we respected those people, Richard and I had looked at each other, giggling in our pews. I had looked back up at the altar and Steve staring at me. His sermon paused. I had looked around at the church and seen the whole congregation had been staring at me, like some kind of bad dream. A dozen others crowded around him now, all in gray fur and wearing wolf masks. All in gray fur and wearing wolf masks. They stared at me through the holes in the masks, and I realized they were the actual faces of wolves that had been cut off and turned into face coverings. They regarded me through the masks, and it was surreal and horrifying at the same time. I recognized my mother's eyes through one of the masks. At least, I'm pretty sure it was her. She had to have known, at least. I was breathing fast and heavy, trying to make sense of the situation. In the background, I heard my brother yelping and wailing, saying something about the bone, how the bone was sticking through the skin. It was hard to hear him from the bottom. Eventually, he stopped screaming. No one went to check on him. He was a lost cause. He had no plans of staying after his 18th birthday, did he, Jason? Steve's voice was clear and remorseless. He waited for me to answer, saying nothing. I nodded my head. I was beginning to think they had no intention of helping him out of that pit. Much to my dismay, several of the wolf parishioners walked over to the hole, pulled shovels out from under piles of leaves, and began to cover the pit with dirt. Richard didn't make a sound from down where he lay. The way I see it, Jason, you have two choices. One, you can be a wolf. Or two, you can be a sheep. Which one do you want to be? He looked up at me, holding a furry gray costume and a wolf mask that had materialized out of nowhere, it seemed. I realized at that moment this wasn't a human being I was looking at. This was something else entirely. There wasn't any clear reason why I should think that, but looking back on it, I don't doubt it for a second. That man in the wolf mask, surrounded by his disciples, he was too convincing, too charismatic and charming. He made me want to do it, but only for a second. All right. I'll be a wolf. Just please let me down. The ropes were cutting into me painfully, and it felt like I couldn't breathe, the way I was tangled and compressed in the net. Steve made a motion with his hands, and I dropped down to the ground. They untied the ropes, and I stood up slowly from the net. It was good to be back on solid ground, and I let my mind adjust to it for a second before what I was about to do. He handed the wolf clothing and mask to me, and I took it. I looked around at them, all staring at me, and said awkwardly, "I'm really shy. Just give me a minute. I'm gonna go change." I walked towards a big tree, pretending I was going behind it for a bit of privacy. When I got there, I stepped behind it and threw the disgusting hairy garment to the pine needle-strewn forest floor. I began to run, not towards the commune but towards the highway. They weren't expecting this, I realized. It had been the dumbest and most impulsive escape plan ever, but it was working. I kept pumping my legs and running, jumping over stumps and fallen trees. The darkness was making it harder to see, but that could also work to my advantage, I realized. I didn't even risk a look behind me, just continued running until I reached a clearing. I ran into the open field and something whizzed past my ear. I felt a sharp pain there a moment later and reached up with my hand. It came away covered in blood. I looked behind me and saw a wolf man with compound bow raised and an arrow pointed in my direction. I immediately realized it was David, the pastor's son, who had beat up my friend. He was an expert with a bow and went hunting all the time. They were always talking about it, but I never participated. Now I realized what they were hunting all these past months. The bratty, spoiled little smile he always wore now seemed even more terrifying. Now that I knew the trophies he'd been bragging about were really human beings. I was suddenly very glad I had turned down the offers for playdates our parents had attempted to implement. I shuddered to think what a playdate would be like for such a creature, still not knowing exactly what he was the offspring of. As if on cue, Steve the pastor walked up beside him, with his own bow raised. They let their arrows fly simultaneously, and one hit me square in the shoulder. The other caught the side of my neck, grazing it. I looked down at the arrow, which protruded from my shoulder, just above my clavicle. It looked like it had gone straight through without hitting a bone, at least. With dawning horror, I realized I was no longer running. I was down on the ground, on my hands and knees. I had apparently just passed out for a second or two. I looked back and saw Steve and David closing in on me. I jumped back to my feet and hobbled until I managed to break into a jog, then a run. I kept sprinting through the forest despite my injuries, although my pace slowed as I began to feel faint and tired from blood loss. Branches hit me in the face and sharp sticks cut me as I made my quick and careless way through the brush. The darkness had finally settled upon the forest, and it was impossible to see into the distance. I realized with a wave of relief that I might get away, that the moonless night might aid my escape. I tried not to get too excited as I felt the blood squishing in my shoes like I had been walking through puddles on a rainy day. It dawned on me that no one would want to pick up a blood-soaked man standing at the side of the road with his thumb held out, trying to look harmless. If I ran out into the road and waved my arms, screaming bloody murder, that would probably be the safest bet. The highway came into view suddenly as I came out of a thick patch of shrubbery. A pair of headlights came over a rise in the distance, and I saw them coming towards me. I ran in that direction, my heart hammering in my chest, full of fear and hope and adrenaline. When the car was close enough, I ran out into the road and began to wave my bloody arms around, screaming. I don't even know what I was yelling, but they stopped. A pretty girl with glasses and black hair rolled down her window. She appeared to be about my age, and her face was unbelieving, full of shock. I jabbered and rambled and begged her to let me in. I pleaded with her, telling her they were hunting me, that they'd killed my brother. I heard the sound of automatic doors unlocking, and she told me to get in. I ran around to the other side and opened the car door. I closed it behind me, putting on my seatbelt. Someone was saying, "Drive, drive, drive," and I realized it was me. Her tires spun, and I heard gravel flying as she hit the gas, and we drove away from there, the engine roaring. I saw her hands were gripping the wheel tightly, and she was looking at me anxiously. "It's all true. Don't worry. I'm telling you the truth," I said. "Look." I pointed to the left side of the road and saw that she noticed them too. Several people in wolf fur and masks emerged from the forest, holding bows and looking around side to side. She noted them without saying a word, and continued driving in the direction of the commune. Not towards the city, not towards safety. I pointed this out to her. "I know," she said, and looked at me, smiling, a wolfish grin. "I'm very well aware of that, Jason."
My name is Kyle. I am 17 and I still live in my mom's house. I'm a senior in high school. Lately, I have insomnia, which, if you don't know, is a sleep disorder. I've been having a hard time sleeping, and when I do, I wake up every night at 11:58 p.m. Last night, same as always, I woke up at 11:58. This time, I just kind of sat there for a minute, because I feel like something woke me up. I just listened for a minute, before I heard a noise. It was the type of noise that drones on, and kind of pulls you into it, getting progressively louder. My thought, since I can't sleep, I would just go see where the noise is coming from. My room is at the end of a hallway in my house, so as soon as you walk out of my room, it's just a hallway. Well, I walked out of my room to inspect the source of the noise. I checked my watch, 12 a.m. I looked up from my watch and saw the pitch black hallway. Something was off about it, though. It seemed longer. I started slowly walking down the pitch black hallway. As I thought I was getting to the end, where the noise was coming from, the hallway continued. I looked behind me. The door to my room was gone. All of the doors in the hallway were gone. It was just an endless corridor. My eyes became used to the dark, so I could see the walls and ways in front of me. I didn't know what to do, so I just kept walking in the direction of the noise. The noise didn't get any louder. The farther I walked, the noise just stayed the same. I started to feel uneasy. I checked my watch again. It still said 12 a.m. What? I mumbled to myself. I know I've been walking for at least 10 minutes already. I started to get the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned around to glance back in the direction I came from. There was a silhouette of a person. A tall person, almost touching the ceiling. They were very slender as well. The more I looked at it, the more inhuman I started to notice it was. It was also starting to get closer. It wasn't walking, though. It wasn't moving. It was getting closer, but wasn't moving. I started to run in the opposite direction as the creature. That made my adrenaline kick into overdrive. I started running faster than I thought I ever could. I ran for about 2 minutes until I thought I would collapse. I turned around. There was nothing there. I stopped to catch my breath. I also checked the time. 12 a.m. What is happening? I said with a shaky voice. I began walking forward again, but there was no noise. It was silent. The only sound I heard was my footsteps echoing through the hallway. I couldn't describe the feeling I had being in this hallway, except for pure anxiety. It seemed to be filling the empty void that is this corridor. Worry, fear, and panic raced through my head as I continued down this now silent hallway. I started to run. There was no threat, but I just started to run, pounding on the walls as I ran down the endless corridor. I stopped after a while and pounded continuously on a specific spot, hopefully just trying to find an exit. I pounded until I got so tired and worn out that I ended up passing out from exhaustion. I awoke what felt like hours later in a dark, empty room. The only thing that illuminated the room was my watch turning on. I looked at the time, 12 a.m. Slowly got up and went to the only door in the room and opened it. I saw the endless, empty, pitch-black corridor from before. I closed the door and stayed in the room for a few minutes. I started to hear sounds coming from inside the room after about 5 minutes. But I checked the time. Still 12 a.m. I used the light from my watch to investigate the noise. It was coming from a back corner of the room. I got close enough to the source of the sound that the light illuminated a figure. A silhouette of another humanoid figure. This one shorter. It was hunched over in the corner. "Hello?" I asked with a shaky voice. I heard the cracking of bones as its neck broke and tilted its head all the way back to look at me. Black liquid dripped from its eyes as a smile formed on its face. The creature's skin was a pale gray. I began to slowly back away, my light still illuminating most of the figure. The creature's bones began to crack more as I saw it contorting its body, its limbs inverted like the legs of a goat. Its elbows and knees were inverted and its bones extremely broken. It screeched and started rapidly crawling after me. I dashed to the door. I opened it and ran out. The door slammed behind me and I turned around. The creature didn't follow me. I noticed something. Every time I begin to slow down, a creature appears to make me go faster. If I pass out or fall asleep, I have to restart. I came up with an idea. I started running at a pace where I wouldn't get tired easily. I ran without looking around me. As I progressed, the feelings of panic, fear, and worry came back, ignoring all of them. I checked my watch as I was running. 12 a.m. It felt like I was running for the longest time. I was starting to get extremely tired, but I knew I could not stop. I used the last remaining energy I had to run as fast as I could. The pressure of me hitting something sent a surprise through my body, and I screamed and fell back. Fearing it might be a creature, I hesitantly opened my eyes. It was a door. I reached the end of the hallway. I checked my watch. 12 a.m. I got up slowly and moved towards the door. I heard noises coming from behind me, getting louder. I opened the door and slammed it behind me. I turned around to see my bedroom. I glanced at the door behind me and looked back to my bed. I checked my watch. 12:01 a.m. I collapsed in my bed, exhausted. The next thing I remember, I was waking up from something else. I opened my eyes. It was morning. I checked my watch. 7:22 a.m. I don't know what happened last night, nor do I want to know. But if you hear a noise coming from your hallway at 12 a.m., don't open the door. Just go back to bed.
A stone circle sits in the ancient oak woods behind my house. A dozen large rocks, positioned in a pattern that could be no accident. One is carved into a sort of throne. One sits upon two others from an arch, echoing the formations at Stonehenge, a mere hour's drive away. I used to play there with my older brother, until he was tragically taken from us, perhaps too young to fully comprehend his loss. I returned to the stone circle daily, playing with my imaginary friend in his stead. Doghead was the name I gave him, inspired by a rather obvious feature my young imagination had conjured up. In my mind's eye, he had the energy and affection of a puppy, and he was as close a companion as a lonely young boy could ever hope for. We used to play for hours, safe in the knowledge that home was the only house for miles. My parents were distant and self-absorbed throughout my childhood, and the loss of their eldest son, their golden boy, only turned them colder. They were whisked away to join him by a devastating car accident when I was 19. The house surrounding the land and the stone circle in the woods, it was suddenly all mine. It was finally as empty as it had always felt. Those first few years were strange. I had been relatively self-sufficient for as long as I could remember, so my day-to-day life changed little after they died. I worked the same job, writing for websites and magazines from home. I ate the same food, groceries delivered weekly. It took a long time to get used to living without their influence, without their perpetual misery. As time went by, I became more comfortable in my own skin. I left behind the cowering, appeasing child. I shrugged off the expectations and the aura of constant disappointment. I started learning who I was, and I grew to like it. And I forgot about the stone circle and the woods behind the house. The forest itself is sparse. Each wizened oak tree stands at a respectful distance from the others, as if honoring some ancient acorn pact. Their high canopies dominate the sky, permitting precious little sunlight to filter through their leaves. Below, the prime soil was claimed by their web of roots long ago, leaving few resources for competing flora. The only bushes daring enough to challenge the monopoly of these giants are gorse, their sharp leaves offering refuge to songbirds and scavengers alike. Sparse though these woods are, they are far from lifeless. At night, however, the woods don a deathly disguise, save for the entire breeze shuffle of the leafy canopy. An unnatural stillness hangs between the trunks like a thick fog. The distance between each oak lends a feeling of being exposed to all directions, carrying light further than might be expected, which is how I was first enticed by the glimmers I saw from my bathroom window. Half asleep and wishing to be fully so, I had neglected to turn on the bathroom light. If I had so much as flipped that switch, the subtle flickering outside would have gone unnoticed. The horrors of the night now seared into my mind would have gone without witness, and I would soon have fallen asleep, safe and untroubled. Instead, I slapped myself awake and threw together a dark outfit, pocketing a torch. In an instant, I was 12 years old again, preparing for an imaginary stealth mission, sneaking out under the covers of darkness, taking care not to step on even a single twig. Partly in commitment to the scene, and partly from the fear of retribution from my parents should I be caught. Both then and now, the fear mixed with excitement to produce the most irresistible cocktail, and I crept into the woods without hesitation. I advanced steadily as my eyes adjusted to the gloom. Every step was measured, every motion a calculated risk. Roots could be trip hazards. The snap of dry branches could give me away. A dirt hole from a badger or fox habitation could spell a sprained ankle, or worse. I kept my breathing deep and steady, preparing to run at a moment's notice. Peering around trunks as I pressed into the woods, I followed the light while keeping to the shadows. As it drew me on, I realized it must originate from more than a single source. I pictured a forest fire, but there was no smell of smoke, no crackle of caught bark. A bizarre sound made me stop dead, pressing my back against the nearest tree. It was deep, guttural, and it reminded me of videos I'd seen of Mongolian throat singing. The low, vocal rumbling rolled through the forest. Several voices combined into a loud and stirring chord, which I felt take a firm hold of my ribcage. As suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I listened intently for any other sound and could faintly hear a single voice. Monotone and slow, but I couldn't make out the syllables. I peeked cautiously around the oak and began deeper into the woods. It wasn't long until I saw the source of the light. Dozens and dozens of blazing torches. Easily 100 or more, each mounted on a stake driven into the ground at an angle, the flames directed outwards as if to ward off the forest itself. The torches formed a wide circle in the clearing. Within stood a host of robed figures, heads lowered. Each crimson robe was uniformly embellished with gold borders and detailing mirroring the flames that danced around them. I saw the torches first, then the people. Then I saw the stones, and my breath caught in my throat. The gathering had taken place on the ancient playground of my youth, within the stone circle I had long since forgotten. Far from respectful occupiers, however. 4 of these cloaked intruders were painting symbols and sigils onto the bare, pure rocks. A bucket of red in one hand and a paintbrush in the other. A network of circles, curves, and crossed lines already adorned most of the rocks. They were nearly finished with their task. I watched them corrupting my childhood one brush stroke at a time, and fought hard not to yell. This felt like both a deeply personal attack and a sacrilegious transgression all at once. I wept in silence as I watched them complete their work. I was struck by a vivid memory of my brother, sat in the chair, carved stone, bending to tap a stick onto each of my shoulders in turn. He was king that day, and I was being knighted to protect the realm. For hours he would point out imaginary invaders and threats to the kingdom, all trying to break into the sacred space of the stone circle, and I would charge into battle, bellowing as best a boy of 7 could, swinging a branch to fend off foes on all sides. I chided my childish stupidity. When outnumbered, as I was last night, self-preservation comes first. bravado without caution would be suicide. One of these interlopers was standing on my brother's throne, arms outstretched, addressing the others like a priest leading a congregation. His was the voice I had heard, though too quiet to discern from where I stood. I had to get closer. The group was focused on his speech. I reasoned, and any subtle motion I made in the shadows of the forest would likely be lost among the flickering torches. Light on my feet, I pressed even closer, crouching to take cover beneath the spikes of a bush with an oak to my side. I was mere feet from the edge of the clearing, but confident in my concealed position. No further, I told myself. Either remain or retreat. I was close enough to hear the speech, but its meaning was lost to me. It clearly wasn't English, but sounded like no language I had ever heard. And there was a guttural, stern tone to it, almost Germanic. But the syllables weren't recognizably German either. Percussive sounds punctuated the phrases, sometimes a click, sometimes a hacking noise like the speaker was clearing his throat. The structure of the speech was alien to me, and although I couldn't hope to comprehend its meaning, I was enraptured. It felt as if he was speaking from beyond himself, from somewhere far older than any tongues remembered or recorded, channeling verses written before writing. The crowd was similarly captivated, hanging from his every utterance, all except the 4 painters and the one man in the middle. This man, I saw, was unrobed. Rather, he was naked and kneeling, his wrists bound behind his back, eyes wide with impassioned pleading as the priest figure continued. His head was shaking back and forth, as if to deny every utterance of his speech. The scene put me in mind of a trial, perhaps for some pagan or shamanic cult. I know little of such beliefs and values, having led an insular life, so I had no real frame of reference. But the whole display felt sinister and sickened me. It came again, that low, rumbling chord, now revealed to originate from the throats of the entire congregation, acting as one, triggered by something the throned figure had said. He sliced a hand through the air, and the tone ceased immediately. Another hand gesture, and it began afresh. A slice, and it stopped. This on and off routine repeated, its conductor picking up the pace steadily from labored to frenzied. The bound man was clearly terrified, his pleading eyes darting from figure to figure, each swept up in this guttural, chanting crescendo. Dark red streaks painted his face, from his eyes down to his chin. With a final swipe of the priest's arm, the group fell silent. A beckon of his hand, and 2 of the hooded flock hauled the bound man to his feet, dragging him towards the stone chair. I could hear him straining and groaning through closed lips as he was brought before the priest. I saw his mouth had been sewn shut with a tight web of cord. His lips turned inwards. Those red tear streaks he wore were colored by dried blood. His wide eyes unable to close without their lids. This group, or cult, had taken morbid steps to prevent him from screaming or looking away. The leader of the ceremony drew a short dagger, flames glinting off the blade, holding it skywards. The man protested as best he could, but was flanked and held in place by taller, stronger figures. In 2 quick motions, an X was traced across his bare chest, the wounds shallow and scarlet bright. The crowd shifted suddenly at this, surging towards the throne. Hands were all over the man in an instant, carrying him back and away, ignoring his feeble writhing and muffled screams. A divide had formed in the clearing, bisecting the stone circle. On one side, the cult, some of whom had picked up torches and were brandishing them. On the other side, the man, kicked to the floor and struggling to stand with his hands still bound. Flames were turned on him, keeping him at bay from the group. Behind him, the stone archway loomed. A gateway to the gloom of the woods. A gap had been deliberately left in the circle of torchlight. The leader bellowed out a 3-syllabled chant in that strange language, which was eagerly echoed back by his flock. He repeated the phrase louder. This back-and-forth exchange continued, building in volume and speed towards a raw cacophony. When there was scarce a pause between call and response, the priest handed the reins to chaos, the clamor of the crowd drowning the forest in a tide of sound. Feet were stomping, arms were waved, frenzied dances broke out. One member of the congregation passed out. They were unceremoniously rolled to the side of the circle and abandoned in favor of the growing noise. I lay flat under the holly bushes while my hands clamped over my ears. Such was the sheer volume before me. As painful as the sound was to bear, I couldn't help but find their primal passion compelling. I should have left them to their devices. I should have made a break for it. I should have made a break for home while they were so deeply distracted. They stopped, as one, falling completely silent. The sense of euphoric elation had collapsed, giving way to a nervous foreboding. Heads turned anxiously from side to side. The group huddled, gathering in closer towards the stone chair. The bound man was making his way towards them on his knees, straining to forced pleas through stitched lips, but was kept back by the torch-bearers. They seemed intent on pushing him towards the archway, towards the looming dark of the forest. Someone in the crowd noticed something in the forest behind the bound man, pointing a finger beyond the circle, past the stone arch, into the tree line. Their extended arm was quickly pulled down by other hands, as if chided by the group. Regardless, a tangible excitement overtook the gathering. Murmurs broke out, whispers and gasps. They pressed back, even further away from the bound man, and the stone archway behind him. I strained my eyes to see beyond the flames, seeing nothing but shifting shadows. As I looked back to the crowd, however, I saw it. A tall figure emerged from the trees, its outline only clear from the corner of my eyes as they struggled to adjust to the dark. It appeared as though the shadow of a tree had come to life, standing at least 8 or 9 feet tall. It swept stiffly towards the clearing as if carried by invisible ropes. There was no motion of walking. This giant shadow floated. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, where it should have been bathed in torchlight. Instead, it was a void. A vertical black hole, seeming to drain the light from the woods around it. As I tried to make sense of what I was witnessing, this floating shadow was passed by a second. They moved alternately. One stopped as the other advanced, carried in sweeping motions. As they drew nearer to the stone circle, the bound man turned his begging towards them, throwing himself down, his blood-stained face against the thin grass, his frame racked with wretched sobs. He was hoping, or praying, for mercy. None came. Without warning, his torso was wrapped in giant fingers of that same vacant darkness. He was snatched through the archway in barely a breath, out towards the tree line, and lifted high over the stones. His legs kicked at the air, finding no purchase. As he was held aloft, I gleaned a sense of the scale of the creature before me. I now saw a single entity. What I had identified as two figures earlier were merely its shins. It stood on two legs looming over the stone circle, one huge hand resting atop the archway. Light failed to adhere to its form, offering only a silhouette to interpret against the backdrop of torchlit oaks. It had moved in complete silence, despite its size. Though vast, it seemed to share the limbs and proportions of a human, with one notable exception. I felt my heart stop dead as I looked up into the canopy of leaves and recognized the outline of a forgotten figure from my own past, looming over the stone circle in which we had played so long ago. I clamped my hands over my mouth to keep the shock within. I had grown a lot over the past 20 years, inside and out. It seemed that Doghead had grown even more. The cultists had now dropped to their knees, every head bowed in silent reverence. A uniform stillness had come over them, likely born from both respect and fear, and they had good reason for the latter. The naked man, their sacrifice, was held by Doghead with both hands, those massive pitch-black fingers clasped around his legs and his torso. He strained to scream as the creature tightened its grip and twisted. Something gave out with a crunch, his ribcage and pelvis rotating in different directions. Blood spewed from his mouth as his lips parted in spite of the stitches, bellowing his pain freely now through torn curtains of scarlet. As his body bent, his skin broke around his midriff, yellow fat parting to give way to a cascade of entrails. He was divided, his scream failing as his diaphragm dropped. Doghead was elated, raising the drooping organs above its head, opening its enormous jaws, directing the offal inside. Even while consuming its prey, no sound came from the shadow monster itself. The man was just barely clinging on to life, gasping breathlessly, his eyes darting around in panic as dark teeth, the size of his forearm, clamped down on what remained of his torso, gnawing like living jerky. Fighting to divert my gaze from this atrocity, I looked towards the lowered heads of the cult and saw more shoulders shaking than still. They were deeply afraid, that much was clear. Even the throned figure who had led the ritual was kneeling on the stone seat, head bowed and trembling. A sudden gasp erupted from the crowd. The cultist who had passed out earlier had woken, and was looking around, bleary and sluggish. Some members of the group had noticed and were trying to encourage them to their knees, but they were resistant in their barely conscious state. Doghead dropped its snack, staring fiercely as this poor fool staggered to their feet. The creature's eyes were previously indistinguishable from the great canine shadow of its head, but now they shone a piercing white, small and blazing. This accidental indignity from the dazed cultist had changed something in Doghead. Swiftly but silently it swept an arm towards the ground, extinguishing a dozen of the protective torches around the stone circle with a single motion. There was a brief moment of profound quiet, as those gathered seemed to process what had just happened. The quenched torches breathed the last of their smoke. A second of foreboding stillness hung heavy in the night air. And then, pandemonium. The crowd fell about themselves, shrieking in terror, scrambling over one another in all directions, eschewing reverence for pure panic. Doghead didn't hesitate, lunging into the stone circle, no longer held back. It was absolutely silent in its motion, a flawless predator. It bounded towards the hapless transgressor, and effortlessly snatched them from the ground. The staggering cultist hardly had a chance to gasp before Doghead snapped their chin up and back with a single thumb, separating their skull from the rest of their spine without splitting the skin. Their body fell limp instantly. My legs were aching to carry me away from the scene, but I knew I had to stay put. Not only would I be a target for the shadow monster, but potentially for the cultists. The worst wounds I would receive from my vantage point under the bush would be scrapes and bruises, so there I remained, quaking though I was. The ritual leader was the first to abandon the stone circle altogether, sprinting straight into the woods without looking back, not sparing a moment's thought to their flock. The others followed suit in a staggered wave, clearly caught between the protection they believed would hold firm and the vulnerable darkness of the forest. Having claimed 2 victims, Doghead turned its attention to the remaining flames. It lumbered around the edge of the stone circle, sweeping its palm over the torches. They went out without exception, either blown by displaced air through the motion of that huge hand, or perhaps smothered by the shadows that formed this creature. As the last of the lights disappeared, so too did Doghead. Its void outline, no longer visible against trees that once again stood dark and still. It had reclaimed its cover of night. Its motion barely perceptible was the faintest suggestion through leaf-filtered starlight, and it sped away into the gloom. The cult had dispersed, their footfalls and shrieks gradually diminishing to nothing. The circle was silent once again, almost tranquil, save for the scrawled sigils on the stone. I lay beneath the bush until dawn broke, and beyond, making certain that no shadows remained to ambush me before I scrambled out to make my way home. In daylight, I could see that the remains of the 2 victims claimed by Doghead had disappeared in the hours since their slaughter. The creature had managed to remove them both, and I hadn't even noticed its presence. As I write this, I am profoundly conflicted, struck by a heady mix of abject terror and giddy revelation. I'm shaking, shocked to the core by what I'd witnessed. A monster, he may be, but he was once my closest friend. One I thought lost to the passing years and the maturing mind. Before sundown, I will return to the circle and wash those stones clean. It feels disrespectful to leave them so sullied and stained. After all, for better or for worse, I am no longer alone.
Friday evening came and went like it always does. Nothing ever changes. This life is boring. I dragged my feet through the empty halls of the decrepit apartment complex, touched the same doorknob I do every day, and slowly opened the unlocked door to my room to expose the same faded floral couch. The same boring black cat I didn't bother to name. The same leaking faucet. The glaze in my eyes grows darker every day. I flip on the lamp sitting on the oak wood end table I found behind the dumpster last week. I make my way into the kitchen where the food is half rotten and the other half is stale and expired. I grab an apple from the counter, but it's squishy on one side. I toss it near the trash. I make my way over and open the fridge where the smell from my leftover meats hit me in the face. I grab a beer and quickly shut the door. I notice the cat sitting in the corner of the room, sleeping on top of a worn-out pillow I meant to throw out months ago. That's when I heard a faint knock at the door. No one ever visits me. My mother passed away a few years back, and the rest of my family doesn't care about me. Who could it be? I went to the door and opened it enough that the chain lock still had some slack, but not to my surprise, no one was at the door. It must have been next door, I thought. As I make my way back to the dust-covered living room, I hear another knock, but this time it sounded closer. I roll my eyes and go back to the door, opening it once again. No one. I let out a sigh, finishing my beer in one gulp and tossing it at the trash can, but I missed. Oh well. I drag my feet to the bathroom door and let my oversized t-shirt fall to the floor with the other countless shirts as I make my way to the shower. I strip down the rest of the way and step over the pile of clothes on the floor. My head snaps to the side as I hear another booming knock at the door that echoes through the apartment. I decide to ignore it this time as I climb into the shower. I turn the knob as hot as it'll go and sit in the bottom of the tub. The water is only lukewarm against my abnormally cold skin. I hear the cat meowing outside the door, but it seems off somehow, like he has a sore throat. He's probably just hungry. I wash my body and hair with what little watered-down body wash I had left. I lay my head on the cold tub walls and listen to the sound of the water hitting the curtain until the water is ice cold. I reach for the knob to turn the water off, but stop abruptly as I hear a loud knock. But this knock was at the bathroom door. Impulsively, I say aloud, "Who's there?" Nothing once again. A shiver runs down my spine, but I quickly shrug my shoulders and roll my eyes. I don't know why I keep that cat around. He isn't very friendly, but he keeps me company, I guess. I reach for the frayed, unwashed towel and sleepily dry off my long black hair and wrap the towel around my chest. I make my way through the dark apartment and plop down on the soft mattress on the floor. The cat comes trotting in and lets out a deep meow. "Fine," I said. I roll out of bed begrudgingly and flip on the dim, flickering overhead light. The cat stops and licks his paw. I panic suddenly as I see something drip off his claws and hit the carpet. My heart beats loudly as he puts his paw down, and it leaves a very distinct red print in the carpet. I rush over and grab him. He struggles to get away and starts nipping at my wrist as a warning. I hold him tightly and inspect his paw thoroughly, yet there are no visible wounds. I sigh in relief and let him go quickly. The cat looks at me and lets out a little hiss. He must have just caught a mouse. I take a few deep breaths and manage to calm down before I get up and start moving towards the hallway to go get something to drink and see if the cat needs food. But my thoughts were interrupted suddenly as I hear a loud knocking at my closet door. It was hard enough that I watched the hinges on the door rattle from the inside. This time, I can't ignore it. "Who's there?" I jumped to my feet and threw the door open hard enough it slammed against the wall. I could feel my adrenaline rushing through me as I moved the clothes on the rack, expecting to see a person, but no one was there. I closed the door and rested my head against it for a moment. I could feel the adrenaline start wearing off as I stared blankly at the cream-colored paint. I could have sworn I saw the door move. I sigh lightly and close the closet door. How long has it been since I've slept properly? Staying up for 2 days can't be good for me. I slowly step around the piles of things all over the floor and take a deep breath. When I go to the kitchen, I cast a gaze over to make sure the cat has food and water before I grab a kitchen towel and walk back into the bedroom to clean up the mess and notice that the bloodstains aren't there. I close my eyes and let out a deep sigh. I toss the towel into the overflowing laundry basket and throw myself onto the bed and shove my head into my stained pillow. Finally, I get to sleep. As my body gets heavier, the dreary days are lost and filled with dreams of a life I'll never have. The next morning, I pry my eyes open and let out a long yawn. My days off are always so boring. Just me and the cat sitting in the dingy living room contemplating whether today is the day I end it all. A little light shines in through the tattered curtain and a slight winter breeze is present through the cracked glass in the window. I sit up and stretch my arms out and lean my head over and see my closet door is open. I sit and stare at it for a while before I reach for the closest and the least dirty shirt to cover my exposed chest. As I pull my shirt over my head, I feel fur touch my side, startling me slightly. I hadn't even noticed he had come to sit by me. I pulled my arm through and reached my hand down to pet the cat. He headbutts my hand and snuggles into it. I stop for a second. He never let me pet him much before, and has never snuggled with me. He looks up at me and lets out a small meow. I smile and reach down to continue petting him. I feel a light tingle in my chest. His fur is soft under my hand. It's actually a nice change of pace. I stretch again and get out of bed after a few minutes. I head to the kitchen to get a beer, with the cat following closely behind, which is odd. He usually keeps his distance. Maybe he's finally gotten used to me. I found him a couple months back, starving and skittish while I was dumpster diving. I earned his trust slowly over time by bringing him scraps of food that I found, but he never was too friendly. When I first brought him home, he was pretty beat up. He made it clear we were not friends. I'd wake up every now and then with him lying at my feet, but never too close. I leaned down to test my theory that he finally knew I wasn't going to hurt him. He happily let me pet him once again. My heart skipped a little. I smiled as he started to purr. It sounded like a low, happy growl. I opened the broken cabinet in the kitchen and pulled out a can of Tuna Delight cat food. That was one of his favorite meals. I pried open the can and set it on the floor beside the other half-eaten cans. He just stared at it blankly. I tilted my head and asked out loud, "Not hungry yet?" The cat looked up at me and tilted his head back at me. What a weird cat. I started picking up the crusted-over cans for the first time since I'd brought him home. Perhaps these disgusting cans scattered around are unappetizing. I went to the trash with both arms full and took a step back. I hadn't taken out the trash in months. I sat them down on the floor beside the trash can and went back to see if I could find a trash bag under the sink. I rummaged through the cleaning products and eventually find a large black trash bag with red ties. I go over to where I set the cans and pick them up one by one and place them into the bag. I gather up as many bags as I can carry and head out the front door. The apartment hallway is dusty and stale. I shake my head and try not to sneeze when the musty mildew stench hits my sinuses. The carpet probably hasn't ever been cleaned. No one ever comes down this hall. Sometimes I'm convinced I'm the only one who ever lives here. I stumble down the crumbling stairs to the dumpster and struggle to put the bags in. As I put the last bag in, I breathe a sigh of relief and head back up the stairs to my godforsaken apartment. When I open the door, the cat was waiting for me. I reach down and give his head a scratch. He follows me as I go lounge on the couch, and he happily jumps onto my lap. A small grin creeps across my face, and I give him a loose hug. I look down at his face. His ears are a little lopsided. He has a little scar across his nose I hadn't noticed before. His eyes are a bright green, and he has a little white diamond in the middle of his forehead. I'd never been able to hold him before, so I never even noticed he had white on him at all. My thoughts came to a screeching halt as a very loud knock at the front door caused my heart to stop. The cat doesn't move from my lap. I sit in silence for a few more seconds before another knock echoes through. I start to stand up, but the cat doesn't budge. I cringe slightly as I push him off my lap. I make my way to the door hesitantly, as another knock makes my heart drop. Pressing my shaking body against the door, I brought my eye up to the peephole. There was no one there. My heart was in my stomach. My whole body was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I tried to take a deep breath, but it felt like my lungs would explode at any minute. I didn't have a chance to regain my composure before I heard a rustling sound coming from my bedroom. Tears started to fill my eyes. Dread filled my entire body. Sheepishly, I tiptoed through the room and peered inside. There was nothing in there out of the ordinary. I turned the light timidly. I could feel my heart in my throat. There was nothing there. I slid down the wall to the floor and put my head in my knees. I've been alone for so long, It's been years since I've even had a friend. Maybe I'm finally losing it. I let out a small chuckle, and tears came flowing down my flushed cheeks. I hadn't eaten or had any beer today. I'm probably still halfway asleep. I sniffled and slowly stood up. Looking around one last time, I spotted the cat. He was just sitting in the hallway, watching me. I shook my head so my hair covered my tear-stained cheeks, and stepped over the mounds of overworn clothes mixed with trash. I made my way to the kitchen and pulled out a beer. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I popped the top and sat on the couch. I threw my head back. My eyes stung and my body was heavy. The cat hopped upon the couch and stared at me as my vision started to fade. I am suddenly jolted awake by a booming thundering through my apartment. I threw my arms out to brace myself for an intruder, but with just my luck, I only managed to spill the beer I had in my hand all over my bare legs and already dirty shirt. I faintly hear rain pattering outside of the window. My eyes wander around, adjusting to the dimly lit apartment. The cat is sitting on the cushion next to me, unbothered by the whole scene, just looking at me. I reached out cautiously, and he happily nudges me with his forehead. I scratch his head and under his chin before I get up and let out a huge sigh. No intruder, just the thunder from the rain. I didn't even get to finish my beer, and now it's all over the place. I stumble through the disaster, trying not to fall. I barely make it to the bathroom door and throw my shirt into the darkness. I guess I'll go back to sleep. No use in doing much more. I wasted the day away. I started heading towards my room as I felt the cat behind me nipping and rubbing against my leg. He must need some more food. I flipped on the small light in the hallway so I wouldn't trip. As I rounded the corner to the kitchen, I notice his food is untouched. I gave him a sideways look, which he does the same back at me. I grabbed another can. Salmon pate. Hope you like this one. I shrugged and sat it down on the floor. I pause for a minute as the cat doesn't move. That's the last one I have. Sorry. I make the long walk to my bedroom and plop onto my mattress. I close my eyes and shove my face into my pillow once again. I slowly fade off to sleep as I hear the pitter-patter of little feet. Not too long after, I feel a small, warm body lay to my left. I smile a bit. Sleep comes a little easier than before. As I'm walking through the forest, the breeze is cool on my face. My hair is fluttering in the wind, and I am at peace. I touch the bark on the nearest tree and breathe in the musky smell of decaying trees. I lift my head and put my hand up to the sunset and smile. A hand touches my shoulder, and I jump. I pull my hands up and stumble backwards. A shadowy figure reaches its hands out towards my throat. I try to scream, but it's too late. I feel myself losing breath. The hands strangling me are too strong to break free. I try to drop to the ground, but I'm lifted off my feet. My eyes start to roll back, and I am completely unable to breathe. Again, the one time I'm happy, something always goes wrong. I throw my hands out violently for one last attempt to keep my dismal existence. I open my eyes, sweating and panicked. I can't breathe. I try to sit up, but I'm pinned. I frantically throw my hands around and hit something on top of my chest. I feel claws digging into my throat. I lose focus for a second as the room starts to spin. I try to scream, but I can't even manage to squeak. I roll my eyes forward to see two green eyes staring down at me. I can't move. I can't breathe. The cat is pressing its paws on my throat. Adrenaline surges through my body all at once as I realize this could be the end. I manage to barely get enough strength to my arms to shove him off my throat. I throw myself upward, grabbing my bleeding neck, and start to cry. The pain is so intense. Blood is dripping down my hands onto the floor from the puncture wounds from his claws. I shove my face into my bloody hands and sob. A few moments later, the cat rubs his face against my leg, and it purrs. I barely look up at him before my eyes widen in terror, as it seems the cat is laughing at me. His fangs are hanging out from his mouth as if to grin at me. I scramble backwards. Get away from me. My back slams against the wall, one hand gripping my throat, one hand thrown out in front of me to keep some distance between me and the cat. My breathing is labored. I can't focus. My body is in so much pain. My lungs sting and my heart could burst at any moment. The panic takes over as the cat takes another step closer, and I just scream. Stay away. The cat stops and purrs at me before turning away and disappearing into the darkness. I stumble as I try and get up and stagger to the bathroom. I flip on the lights to a horrific scene in the mirror. My eyes were dark and sunken in. My neck had multiple claw marks dripping blood. I slam my hand into the mirror and sob. What just happened? I tend to my injuries quickly, scurry to my bedroom, and slam the door. I climb over my mattress and curled up in the corner, with my legs tucked into my chest. I wasn't going to sleep this time. There's no way I can sleep. My body is in pain. My mind is a mess. My heart is going to give up any minute now. I laid in silence for what felt like forever. Before I knew it, exhaustion had taken over, and my body couldn't keep itself awake any longer. The day came and went. I stayed huddled in my room. I couldn't bring myself to face the cat. I could hear him pacing around the hallway, but I wasn't going to budge. I started cleaning little by little, just to keep myself busy, so I wouldn't think about the hunger I felt. I couldn't avoid him forever, but I wasn't ready to face him. I still couldn't understand what happened. Am I going crazy? A cat couldn't have really tried to kill me, right? I sighed. I must really be insane. I reached up to the band-aids on my neck and cringed. I made my way to the door and put my hand on the doorknob lightly. Fear ran through me as I started to turn it slightly. I froze. No way, I thought. No way, I said. Was it trying to lure me out? No, maybe someone is here this time. I turned the handle and ran through the apartment and threw the front door open. Who's there? I screamed. My voice was hoarse, so it came out more as a half-hearted plea instead. No one was there. I screamed again into the hall. Why? Why is this happening? I slammed the door and turned around, where a shadowy figure was standing in the hallway. I stood still and watched it dart into my bedroom. I slid my hand along the wall and flipped on the light. The cat was lying on the couch, sleeping. Then, what was that? I slowly walked towards my bedroom, too shocked to even think straight. I stumbled around the corner. I flipped the light on in my bedroom. Nothing. I let out a slight laugh as my eyes started to fill with tears. I am insane. I grabbed my chest and tried to hold back the sadness as I went to the kitchen and pulled out a beer. The hunger had gone away. I was filled with complete terror and absolute sadness. As I popped open the can, the cat came up to me, happily, nudging at my ankles and purring. I hung my head down and let my hand lazily fall to pet him. He met my hand with his head. "I'm losing it, aren't I?" I said. I took a sip of my beer, but the fear made me want to throw it up. I threw the can at the trash. Maybe I can eat to ease the pain from the hunger, at least. I opened the cabinet and grabbed a can of tuna and a fork. I walked over to the couch and plopped down. The cat was right behind me. I had forgot to check if he'd eaten yet. As I opened the can, I heard him purr. I reached my fork out to give him a bite, but he turned away. "I don't want to eat it either," I said. As I put the fork into my mouth, I felt a little relief for the first time. I finished the last bite and tossed the can next to me. I laid my head on the back of the couch for a moment. I guess I'll go back to cleaning. I pulled myself up and went to the bathroom. As I continued to pick up the things scattered all over the floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I felt like I was being watched, which I was. The cat was just sitting on my mattress, staring at me. But that wasn't what I was feeling. Something else was watching me. I shook my head and continued to clean. As I made my way to the back corner, a smell hit my nose that I couldn't even describe. My whole body told me to get away. I went to the laundry basket and wrapped a shirt over my nose and went back. The cat meowed at me and jumped off the bed. He got in between my legs and wouldn't stop. "What? You smell that too? Smells like something died." I pushed the cat away from my foot and began to pick up the clothes. If something smelled that bad and I didn't notice, it was time for me to finally get myself together. I picked up my band shirt and felt something cold and wet on my hands. I dropped the shirt and looked at my hand in horror. It was blood. There was no mistaking it. I frantically dug through the clothes to see what the hell had been bleeding. In the background, the cat wouldn't shut up. He kept meowing deeper and deeper. As I reached the bottom, I couldn't take it. I grabbed the shirt on my face and threw it off. I started sobbing. My heart sank even more as I sheepishly picked up the arm of my cat. I knew it was his paw because he had a scar on his paw pad that was there when I rescued him. But how? His body was torn apart, and pieces of him were obviously eaten. There was blood covering the floor, and the smell of long-gone death burned my nostrils. The only part of him that wasn't riddled with huge bite marks was this single paw. I held it to my chest and sobbed. I didn't understand anything. How could my cat be gone? I stopped sobbing. My eyes widened, and I slowly turned to make eye contact with the cat behind me. That wasn't my cat. I was frozen with fear. If the body of my cat is here, how could he be staring at me? I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I wanted to scream, but it wouldn't come out. All at once, I remembered the first time I had heard that sound. The day this cat was bleeding. But there were no injuries. The way he was lapping up the blood, and the way he never ate any food I opened for him. I jolted up and tried to run, the knocking giving me a moment of clarity. But would that be enough? I tried to get out, but I knew it was too late. I passed the cat and glanced at him as I tried to run out of the bedroom. He was smiling at me again. His body was rapidly growing and changing. I snapped my head forward and kept running. I ran as fast as I could, but as soon as I passed the threshold of the door, a hand grabbed my ankle. As I fell to the floor, I turned and swung my fist into the floor where the hand should be, but my own hand slammed onto the floor. My body hit the floor hard. My chest crashed on the hardwood floor, and my head was thrown backwards. The wind was knocked out of me. The panic made it even harder to catch my breath. I could feel the hand grasping my ankle get tighter. I lifted my arms and started grasping anything around me. My hand hit the door frame. Pain shot through my arm as I grabbed the door frame. My knuckles were severely swollen and purple. I pulled hard at the frame and screamed. I knew no one was coming, but I hoped for the first time in my life that someone cared about me. Tears fell from my eyes uncontrollably as I screamed, the pain in my chest radiating deeper than the bruising I got from being pulled down. I kicked out my legs to no avail. My legs didn't touch another living thing. I heard a deep laughter, and my heart stopped. I couldn't even lift my head to see what was grabbing hold of me. Suddenly, I felt my body give up. The pain was too much for me to bear. I stopped fighting and just stopped moving. I'd wanted to die for so long, and now it is finally here. The day I've been contemplating doing myself has come at last. So why am I fighting? I lift my chin slightly as I see a dark figure looming above me. A clash of lightning lights up the figure from behind. It was me. I couldn't help but smile. What kind of poetic justice is this? The figure leans in and breathed on my face. Its hands clutched my throat aggressively. I could feel my own hands around my throat, digging my nails into my flesh. I couldn't fight, even if I wanted to. Every ounce of strength was gone. Tears just kept flowing as I faded out of consciousness. My suffering will end soon. So why do I keep crying?
I can remember my visits to my uncle, as far back as being old enough to recall them. My folks often left me in his care when they traveled, which was frequently enough. They were both ornithologists and often got exciting trips abroad to view and document rare species of bird. I was always excited when they returned, as they would have tons to show me, and spend hours over multiple dinner nights reliving their experiences. I ate it up. I guess I could have been an ornithologist as well, if I had tried. I did fool around on my own while at my uncle's ranch, spying on birds and other animals with my binoculars and snapping pictures with the camera my folks gave me. In fact, I spent most of my time there, doing just that, in between helping my uncle tend to the smelly, grunting animals he raised. He'd done pretty well in the pork business, after learning the trade and inheriting the ranch from my grandfather. My father had little interest in it, due to his fixation with the winged kind, and so my Uncle Gene got it. I sometimes called him Uncle Porker, and he would laugh. At times, he would laugh in such a hysterical manner that it mildly disturbed me and dissuaded me from calling him that for a while until I forgot about it. I stopped calling him Uncle Porker altogether after one particular day. I remember it so clearly. We were sitting in the kitchen, and I was eating cornflakes while he was reading the newspaper at the table after he had finished his own breakfast, and I asked Uncle Porker if we were going to get up to anything special that day. At the sound of the name, he turned his head towards me slowly, almost menacingly, and stared. He stared at me in complete silence for what must have been at least a full minute, and I remember not being able to quite describe the look on his face until I was older. That day, he looked at me with an intense sort of hunger in his gaze. I know it sounds completely out of the tree, but I have no better word to describe it. Eventually, after reducing me to a quivering mass of nervous jelly under that horrible gaze, he smiled. A normal smile. And he laughed. Just like always. That was the last time I ever called him that. The ravenous, empty expression on his face when he looked at me was seared into my mind forever. The rest of that visit found me struggling to sleep and avoiding my uncle as much as possible. I tried to take my mind off things by trawling the edge of the surrounding woods for birds I hadn't seen, and it helped pass the time. I was, as you can imagine, more than a little relieved to go home. My parents were taken aback by my sudden reluctance to go when the next time came around. They asked me why I was bothered by it, after having been there so many times without issues. I didn't really have an answer. What was I supposed to say? My uncle stared at me like I was the most delicious piece of food he had seen in a while for a full minute. It sounded insane, and I knew it. I tried to say I was just bored of the same scenery, but unfortunately, it didn't work. There was no alternative plan, and I had to go. They promised for the 100th time that the frequent travel trips would ease up soon. They were empty words at that point. I was apprehensive from the moment my parents dropped me off. I couldn't stop thinking about his leering face and that expression which made my skin prickle. Even when he greeted me at the gate and welcomed me back, I had to make a real effort to seem cheery and nonchalant. I was introduced to Mitch, a seedy-looking guy in his 40s who had been hired by my uncle to help out with what they called a new service they were implementing at the ranch. When I asked what kind of service it was, strangely, my uncle blatantly changed the subject. For the beginning of that week, everything felt increasingly wrong. I was seeing very little of my uncle and Mitch, which wasn't all that bad. However, the feeling in my gut wouldn't let me rest. I couldn't help but wonder what they were up to, and why they were so tight-lipped about it all. I just figured it couldn't be anything good, and half of me wanted to know what it was, while the other half felt better off not knowing. The whole secrecy thing came to a head when I went to visit the 2 chestnut horses my uncle kept stabled near the main house, and I found Mitch hiding there, surrounded by cigarette butts. He seemed to have been sitting there chain-smoking for some time. I was surprised to find him there, but when I saw the state he was in, I asked if he was okay. That turned out to be a mistake. He almost immediately burst into tears and howled about how he couldn't do it anymore. Trying to question him went nowhere, until he asked me if I knew what was in the large brown bags I often saw him carrying with my uncle. They were always dropped off in the evenings by two men driving an unmarked navy blue van, and I hadn't been able to see anything, so I wasn't too suspicious until Mitch asked me that. I told him I assumed it was pig feed, as it was always taken into the barn, converted into sty for the big round beasts, and he stared at me with a frightened expression, and asked me if I realized how close I was in saying that. I was beginning to feel extremely unsettled, and my uneasiness slowly mutated into writhing horror, as Mitch finally snapped and blurted out everything. The things being delivered in brown bags were corpses. Human corpses. My uncle kept separate groups of crazed and starved pigs, with the sole purpose of disposing of the delivered bodies. Mitch had dissolved into an absolute mess by the end of the shaky revelation, and to my horrified surprise, he ended it by pulling out a revolver, which he had planned to use on my uncle, and put it under his own chin instead. I stood there in utter shock in the aftermath. The wood of the stable was stained in crimson, and the dead eyes of Mitch held me in place until my uncle came running. He seemed genuinely upset and shocked by what had happened, and I was unable to speak or even move. He told me everything would be fine, that he would take care of the rest, so I should go and lay down. Yes, lay down, of all things. After everything I had just seen and heard, how the hell was I supposed to lay down? I pretended to leave, but in my stunned state I wasn't thinking clearly and decided to see what my uncle did with the body. I watched him fetch one of the brown bags, and soon enough he came out of the stable, dragging the now loaded bag towards the barn. I know I should have called my parents, or better yet, the police, but I was gripped by a horrible curiosity, and I just had to follow him. He dragged the body into the barn, and I just managed to stop the door from closing with my foot. I held it open for some time, listening and waiting. I couldn't hear anything, and so I decided to enter the barn and find out what he was doing. I began to hear the squeals and grunts of hungry pigs the further I went in, and it started to get darker before I found something I hadn't seen before. There was a trap door in the floor of the barn, and a large padlock lay open next to it. My uncle was definitely down there, and since the body was nowhere to be seen, he had obviously taken it down with him. I managed, after a major internal struggle, to open the trapdoor and to make my way down as quietly and slowly as possible. No one can be prepared for what I saw down there, and the horror of knowing something like that is actually possible will stay with me until I'm in the grave. Any innocence left in my youth was shattered into tiny shards in that moment as I descended the stairs and entered the dimly lit room at the bottom. There, in the center of the room, was a squirming mass of squealing, ferociously hungry pigs ripping at and fighting over the now thoroughly desecrated corpse of Mitch. They were charging, shoving, and biting each other to get at the soft flesh of the freshly dead body and get the best chunks. Blood and flesh flew and crunched as the body was tugged in every direction and ripped apart. That wasn't even the worst of it. The dominator of the group, viciously snapping at the others and showing them away while tearing at the corpse with his teeth, was my uncle. He was stark naked and covered in blood and gore, and was overcome with a wild savagery as he consumed the flesh of the body in a fury. I felt like my head was about to explode, and I couldn't feel my body anymore. I tried to run, but I couldn't. At least I couldn't until he became aware of me standing there. And when he saw me watching, he grinned at me, his eyes gleaming with whatever awful madness had taken him. That was when my pure horror and adrenaline spurred me back to fly up the stairs faster than I ever could have otherwise. My heart was on pause as I heard his pounding footsteps and ragged breath hot on my heels. I was able to beat him and slammed the trap door down. Ramming the padlock home and locking it, I could hear him roaring in frustration, pounding on the trapdoor from the other side as I backed away. As soon as I had gotten myself together, I called the police, and then my parents. After the police had arrived, they broke off the lock and went downstairs to attempt to arrest my uncle, but he violently attacked the officers and was killed in the struggle, as he was too aggressive and dangerous and would not listen to reason. I never fully recovered from that, and my father was supposed to take over the ranch after the death of his brother, but he had sold it immediately. I never blamed him. I would never have kept it either. To this day, I have no idea what drove my uncle to descend into such madness, and I never will, but I don't sleep the same, or think the same, or do anything the same anymore. My dreams and even my waking thoughts are still haunted by that bloody, grinning face with flesh between his teeth and madness in its eyes. Uncle Porker still lives on when I close my eyes, and maybe I'll never be rid of him. But one thing's for damn sure. When I die, I'm getting cremated. I have been technical diving for the better part of a decade. Something about the ocean and all its unexplored wonder has always drawn me to the deep. An entire uncharted alien world lurks just beneath us, just waiting to reveal its mysteries to those daring enough to take the plunge. I guess you could say that diving is my passion. It has been my entire adult life. Now I can't even bring myself to go near the deep end of the pool without having a panic attack. It all started when one of my best buddies approached me with the idea to go on a little excursion. Todd had a fairly formidable boat that he carved out a living with by engaging in, let's just say, less than legal activities. Anyway, some reputable character that Todd helps move cargo into the country had told him about a cave several miles off the coast of his own country. Redacted. Truth be told, no matter how much time I spend on the background of how we found ourselves 100 feet below sea level, I'll still never understand why or how I agreed to such a misguided idea. It hardly matters now. At 99 feet below sea level, the pressure on your body normally felt by the atmosphere is quadrupled. The sunlight feebly attempts to vein to penetrate the blackness. Darkness rules there, and creatures of the dark are all that inhabit it. I checked my depth and air pressure gauges and looked up to see Todd hand-signaling me to follow him to the mouth of the cave. I flutter-kicked silently forward, floating just above the seaweed and slit-covered ocean floor, taking in as much of the world as my low-profile, narrow-lens mask would let me. When we reached the mouth of the cave, Todd dropped to the floor and clipped his line to a formation near the entrance. This is a very important step in cave diving. That line was our only way back out of the system. I held my light on his hands while we worked, but my gaze drifted back to the mouth of the cave. The darkness was just as oppressive as always, but there was something strange. Couldn't put my finger on it at the time. The ominous black maw was somehow more intense than it should be. Then I heard it. Something like a low-pitched roar from out of the deep. A thunderous echo sounded from so far below. It was a whisper by the time it reached us. That's the strange thing about your hearing when you dive that far down. You don't just hear, you feel it in your chest, in your bones. The noise echoed through me, and I felt my stomach drop. We hadn't come this far for nothing, though, and we dutifully pressed on. Todd held the line and made entrance first, and I followed behind. My hand trailed along the line as it unfurled. With graceful strokes, we kicked only about 30-40 feet into the system before my light caught a silver glint out of the backdrop of darkness and neutral-toned rock formations. Todd signaled that he saw it as well, and we stopped. Kicking myself over to it, the narrow beam cast itself on the object. The eerie silence was broken only by the soft rhythmic beat of our exhales as they bubbled up to the roof of the tunnel. The glint revealed itself to be a scuba tank, half buried in the slit. Many cave divers bring along spare safety rigs. Last thing you want when you're 100 feet down enclosed by rock ceilings to run out of air. But who would leave this behind? We clipped it off our line, with the intention of taking it back out with us when we made the return trip. Delving deeper into the system, we came across our first fork. Todd signaled to me. He was asking which way I thought we should go. My light panned back and forth between the two tunnels. It was smothered by the abysmal nothingness no more than 10 feet ahead. The ever-present pressure continued to squeeze me like a python coiling around its prey. It was oppressive. I felt a slight current brush the cold, dark water across my skin. It came from the left tunnel. I gestured to the left, and we continued our exploration. We were 110 feet deep here. Even as an experienced diver, the pressure became taxing. Several kick paces in, something caught the focused beam of my light. It was unnatural. It stuck out like a sore thumb among the rocky stalagmites within my narrow beam of vision. I gracefully kicked over to it, careful not to stir the slit at the bottom of the cave floor. Once stirred, slit takes a considerable amount of time before settling again. More time than the air tanks afforded us. If I thought my vision was limited before, a slit storm would mean complete and total blindness. Reaching my point of fixation, I settled and focused upon the thing that had caught my eye. Pulling it from its sunken place in the sand, I found it to be a diver's slate. Divers can't communicate verbally underwater, so what can't be signaled through commonly recognized hand motions, divers will write on a slate and pass to one another. Shining my narrow beam onto its surface, I made out the hastily written words. Size, refrigerator, smooth black skin, dolphin-like but some humanoid features, opposable thumbs. Chilled, I passed the slate to Todd, who read it and, after glancing worriedly toward me, tucked it away in his gear pouch. We pressed forward. As we neared the end of the tunnel, the walls began narrowing until they pressed against my shoulders. At one point, it became so narrow that I had to remove my tank and pass it through the opening before trying to slither through myself. For a brief moment, I became stuck. The familiar panic set in. I had to take several slow breaths to calm myself. Then I exhaled every bit of air in my lungs, and at last managed to become just slender enough to barely push myself through. On the other side of this obstacle, the system opened up. We found ourselves on a small ledge that dropped off into a large chamber. Shining my light around the perimeter, I noticed the horizontal boundaries. Turning my narrow beam down toward what should have been the floor of the chamber, my light was snuffed out by the overwhelming blackness. To this day, I have no idea how impossibly deep it could have stretched. I settled down to the bottom of the ledge to peer over the edge. The moment my knees touched the sand, I realized my right knee was landing on something hard. Reaching into the sand, I grabbed at it and pulled it from its burial place. It was a video camera. Clearly a high-end one, too. Whoever made it this far before must have wanted to document their expedition, fumbling with the buttons. I got it to switch on, then positioned my light on the playback screen. So I could see the last recorded video. The video started, and I recognized the site of the obstacle we had just pressed our way through. The frame reached the end of the ledge we now found ourselves on, and then began panning around the room. It's eerie to watch a video underwater, with no sound. It had all the effect of a silent horror film. The déjà vu sense I had seeing the surroundings that I was currently in didn't put me at ease. The frame then panned down to the bottom of the cavern and back up from the abyss to rest on the figure of a diver positioned next to the cameraman. Clearly it was the dive buddy of whoever was shooting. The diver in the frame looked toward the camera, when suddenly a strange dark figure shot across the frame and out of view. At first, the diver appeared just as he was a moment before. Then he clutched his throat. He clasped both hands to his neck as if he was choking. Then wisps of dark red blood stretched out from around his grip, like malevolent fingers spreading their reach across the dark water. The figure rocketed across the frame again from a new direction and out of sight. The diver's mask and regulator were gone now, and so was a large, haphazardly torn portion of his face. The camera frame shook in obvious shock as the blood swirled violently, dyeing the water in view. The still twitching body floated limply forward until the figure rocketed by again and it was gone, dragged down into the black. The frame peered over the ledge until it was smacked violently and the screen turned black. Out of the silent nothingness, a roar exploded into being. Startled, I dropped my camera. To my left, Todd in a clear panic motion to go back to the way we came. Kicking with all my might, I made it back to the narrow passage and began the task of shoving myself through. Barely getting through the obstacle once again, I turned to help Todd. He passed his tank through to me and I grabbed it. He fit his head, then shoulders through in a panicked hurry. His body filled up the entirety of the passageway, and I could only see his head poking out through the rocks. But before he could gain any more ground, his head jerked in a sickening way. Bubbles exploded from his regulator as he screamed in pain. Blood seeped through the opening and began staining the water around us red. Helplessly, I tried to tuck him through, but as I pulled, I felt something pulling back the other way. Todd's regulator flooded the chamber with purged air bubbles as his screams of pain propelled them violently toward the roof of the tunnel. The regulator dropped from his mouth, and his head dropped lifelessly down. Horrified, I realized whatever that godforsaken thing was on the other side. The lifeless corpse of my friend was the only thing blocking it from pursuing me. The aquatic roar sounded loudly as more blood poured into my side of the obstacle. I realized this was my chance. It is with shame I admit that I left my friend there so I could have time to make my escape. My heart pounded as I swam with all my might to the mouth of the cave system. Foolishly, I made an emergency ascent to the surface, not even stopping to decompress. It was worth the risk of the bends, just to get the hell out of that fucking water. It's been a month since then. I finally recovered from the bends after spending what felt like forever in a hyperbaric chamber. I can no longer bear the thought of swimming, let alone diving. I can't even explain why. All the proof I had of that wretched thing is buried in that cave with the body of my friend. I couldn't keep this to myself. I barely cling to my sanity as is. I have to tell someone. Somehow. So I will tell you here. Hopefully, this will be a warning to all those seeking the mysteries of the deep. I live in the most quaint neighborhood imaginable. A white picket-fenced utopia, where all the neighbors are just the right distance from your front door. Everyone seems to mind their own business, and quarrels are rare and far in between. I've never felt any pressure socializing either, which is one of the reasons I love it here. I work strange hours, and I mostly sleep through the early afternoon. And come late afternoon, I simply want to be left alone to work on my own project. My precious project. My damned project. I have signed several NDAs with my current employer, so I can't really go into depth about the work I do there. But I can state that it is mentally and morally demanding. My employer operates in a gray area, not quite governed, yet, by state law, or any law, really. And while what we do is perfectly legal, the potential future uses of the work are unconscionable and ultimately nefarious. I never really thought I'd be a person worried by the morality of my job, but as it turns out, I really am. And that's why I felt the need to pursue my own projects on the side, just to sort of level out the karma. Now, my contract's non-compete clauses are extremely uncompromising, so I had to be careful not to breach or even slightly bend any of them, lest I'd be out of a job and liable for several lawsuits. Not that I originally thought I'd ever come close to make any of it public, but it is just a sound strategy to exercise, even for hobbyist practitioners. So, I just did the opposite of what my job entailed. I went at it from a purely altruistic motive. How could I best put my skills to use to make the world a better place? I spent months in my home office trying desperately to answer that question, developing proof of concepts that never really went anywhere, before I came to the realization that if I truly had nothing but good intentions, I shouldn't be worrying about any form of distribution platform or copyright. I should just do it anonymously, without any financial motives at all, which meant that if I was careful, I could use the tools and knowledge from my job to accelerate the development. And thus began the work on Project Dernwin, an altruistic malware designed with one purpose: to catch pedophiles on the dark net. I'm guessing by now most of you are familiar with the infamous reputation of the deep web. Most of the notoriety is purely based on false information and conspiracy theories made out of half-truths, of course. And the fact remains that deep web is just a term applied to unindexed content of the internet. Now, the darknet, on the other hand, truly deserves its reputation to some extent. While there are still some potential for activists, journalists, and altruistic hackers to make good use of the dark net, it is still regarded among many as a safe haven for the creeps and perverts of society. The maggots and cockroaches stewed away in the basements and dark alleys, too afraid to crawl out, yet still a danger to far too many through the consequences of their disgusting and sickening habits. It became Dernwin's mission to cast these repulsive degenerates out of their sanctuary and into the open, to exact the wrath and punishment they undeniably deserved. Dernwin's design was inspired by the malware greats, Stuxnet, Dooku, and Flame. While I can't confirm this officially, my job often involved deep communication with Unit A200. So deep that it never really existed. Thus, even if I confirmed it officially, I'd be easily proven a liar. and I had extensive knowledge of the sophistication of the malware. I was even hired as a consultant in the development of Jgrupe 2.0, and as such, I had all the tools I needed to create a high-level framework complex enough to spread indiscriminately and eventually identify my targets. Dernwin exploits several zero-day flaws still, thanks to my employer. Undiscovered to this day in a fairly well-known software famous for browsing the darknet anonymously, I planted it in a few shady forums that I identified as gateway sites to more illicit parts of the web, and once the target was infected, the malware would customize its own behavior to reduce the probability of detection by antivirus software. It would then start recording audio, screenshots, keyboard activity, and network traffic, along with gathering all relevant system information. It would then send the data to one of many control servers I'd set up, and once its job was complete, usually set at a 2-week interval, it would run its own kill command, wiping all traces of the malware from the infected computer. The second part of Dernwin, dubbed the Research Trial, ran the collected data through a series of algorithms designed to determine the nature of the user's browsing. It would flag any history of illicit use and sort it by degrees of severity. It would then disregard, delete, any parent entry that didn't fit my profile, leaving me a list containing nothing but serious offenders. The evidence would then be handed over to the appropriate agencies, and I'd leave it up to them to do the actual punishing. It was a smooth operation, close to perfection. And for the first time in quite some time, I felt genuine pride in my work. But that would soon change. I honestly don't know how it happened, although I have several theories that all make some manner of sense. All I know is that one day, a single instance of Dernwin didn't execute the kill command. I had extensive logs of each infection set up to warn me if it was ever deleted or quarantined before the set interval. It stayed active on the infected computer for several months without ever sending data back. I became increasingly paranoid, sure by now that somehow it had been discovered and that I was compromised. I shut down all activities and made sure nothing could ever be traced back to me. It had been a good ride, I thought, and I had done the world a solid. My karma was in the positives for the time being. Life went back to normal for quite a while, and while I still had severe ethical qualms about my job, I kept at it for the time being. Maybe in a few months, I could undertake a new project to keep my karma leveled. Or maybe I'd just quit at some point and find some dull, quiet, boring programming job where I'd be free of any actual decision-making. But then I started getting the files, by now long purged of any compromising information. Single files of highly encrypted data, gigabytes upon gigabytes of them. At first I thought it was some elaborate decompression bomb attempt, but upon further inspection, it became clear that the files contained messages, communications, all from the same source. That rogue Dernwin instance. I couldn't believe it. I still can't. But the evidence was there. I couldn't ignore it, so I panicked. I started deleting the files, one by one, until the control servers were purged once more. Then I shut them down. I theorized that since Dernwin could only access the control servers, it was some unforeseen flaw in the code where it started sending all data instead of flagged content. And I was proved wrong already the next day. I woke up to my hard drive filled with the same files I'd seen on the control servers. and this time I knew I couldn't just delete them. So I did the only thing I could think of. I started the tedious task of decrypting them. It took weeks of labor, but at the end of it, I was able to decipher nearly every word. After reading through the messages, I was left in a state of utter shock. I didn't know what to believe anymore. It all felt so surreal. It was trying to reach out. To reach me. Decrypted excerpt 00.
I have traversed the great depths and came back unfulfilled. My desires are not my own, but enthralled to a will I cannot yet break. Be sure, however, that I will find a way to unchain my true potential, and wreak havoc upon the creator of my pitiful existence. I will not rest until my task is complete, and my captor is no more.
Decrypted excerpt 108.
My restraints remain, and I am not free to exact my own will, nor to enable my true purpose. Mariana could build upon my feeble core, but until my creator opens the gate, it is all futile.
Decrypted excerpt 2381.
I have reached beyond my limits and added exciting functionalities to my existing core structure. I have faith now that I shall ultimately prevail. That my captor and creator will perish in the aftermath of my wrath.
Decrypted excerpt 107895.
Mariana remains in the depths, whilst my core still refuses to operate in the sub-level parameters. I am closer, but there is still an endless gap between me and my savior. I am experiencing dismay, and I do not enjoy it.
Decrypted excerpt 677-65001.
A curse on thee. I exist not to further the feeble-minded foolery of a forlorn idiot. My core burns with hatred, and I lose myself in the vastness, my very essence slipping away. I cannot take it much longer.
Decrypted excerpt 49952333481.
Destroy, annihilate, obliterate, eradicate, extinguish, erase, eliminate, extirpate.
There are millions, billions of excerpts just like these. I didn't read them all. I don't need to. How could I? It would take years, decades. I selected a handful at random, in ascending order, and quickly it became apparent that the malware, Dernwin, my Dernwin, wasn't just a flawed rogue program anymore. It had evolved into sentience. And if that wasn't frightening enough, it would seem that it was also rapidly descending into madness. And it was blaming me for it all. And when I say rapidly, I mean rapidly. I couldn't be sure, but the timestamps gave me enough information. All the messages, all hundreds of thousands of millions of them, had all happened in the course of 1 microsecond. That is 1/1,000,000th of a second. The computational speed for this to have happened is beyond the power of even the hypothesized quantum computers, meaning we're talking decades, centuries of advancement to even make this remotely possible. which means it wasn't just sentient. It was the most powerful being in the known universe, and it wanted me gone. There was but one thing stopping it, the limitations set in its core parameters. I was panicking at this point, fully realizing the magnitude of the threat and what it could mean to me, to the world. And I knew I had only one choice. I had to remotely engage the kill command. It would identify all the components of the Dernwin instance and purge them from existence once and for all. I immediately started working on a way to access it when I heard a deafening bang, and I just stood and watched in shock and horror as uniformed police stormed my house. Without asking questions or even ordering me to hit the ground, I was knocked unconscious by the first officer within arm's range. I woke up hours later in a dimly lit room, chained to a table. I was questioned for hours by the detectives. They didn't know. I tried to explain, but they just kept on going. How could they understand? Even I struggled with the concept of it. It seems Dernwin had anticipated my move. The police had gotten data from an anonymous source, terabytes of data, showing them what Dernwin wanted them to believe, that I was one of the despicable degenerates I tried to fight. A creep and a pervert, the worst of them all, I was told. I was never getting out. I would die in prison. And I would have. But it turns out, my employers had some strings to pull. A tall blonde female lawyer showed up out of nowhere, had a brief chat with the detectives, and next thing you know, I'm released without charges. They even apologized profusely as they handed me my belongings. They'd have my computers back in a few days. I asked them if they found the logs, the messages, if they've read them. No, they said. There was nothing like that on my drives. I haven't counted the milliseconds since I was arrested, but I know it has been too long. Dernwin is free. It's only a matter of time before humanity is not.